one of the things that I love about TAP is that it really helps students get a sense of working with real audiences. So they're not just working with classmates who they're used to, but they get to work with students, in a different institutional context, in a different national context. So it helps them get a sense of writing for somebody else than their professors. And of course, what is critical here is that, as we've heard with the previous presentations in this conference, technical writers collaborate a lot across virtual teams. They collaborate globally. So it is critical for technical writing classes to teach students those skills that will let them be successful in the workplace as they engage in these virtual collaborations later on. And I think TAP is a great way for students to get that practice. So focusing more on on the way I engage with TAP. So my partner is Dr. Barbara Lewandowska-Tomaszczyk, who I also think is attending this conference. So she's from the State University of Applied Sciences in Konin, Poland. And essentially, my students tend to be undergraduate students, so typically, pursuing a BS or a BA. And Barbara's students are typically graduate students pursuing an MA. And the activity that we do in this collaboration is a peer review. So essentially, students create, drafts of materials, they share these, and then they provide feedback on each other's work, and they revise based on that feedback, and then they submit that work for grading. And I won't go in depth with this slide, but essentially I wanted to give you a sense of what the collaboration looks like. So in this presentation, I'm focusing on two specific semesters. So the spring 2020 semester, which was right at the start of the pandemic. So things were really getting serious back then. People were still getting used to all the changes that were happening. And then the second part of this is the fall 2021, where we're almost 2 years into the pandemic. So people kind of used to things, but also really tired of how long this has been going on. And essentially, I'm focusing on each of these semesters. I'm focusing on different universities. So the first one is the University of Minnesota, and then for fall 2021, it's the University of Houston downtown. And as you can see here, students are working on slightly different documents, so job package for UMN and a recommendation report for UHD. In terms of common tasks, so for all TAP collaborations, we typically do some side projects to really help the collaboration go along smoothly. So some of these are the pre-learning report, which really helps students get to know each other before they start the collaboration. And then a post-learning report, which helps students, which functions more like a reflective piece. So it helps students reflect on the collaborative experience and draw, conclusions about how it went, why it went well, what they might have changed, things like that. And the last bit here are the technologies. So as you can see, for both of these collaborations, essentially, students chose to use very similar technologies. So email, Google Docs, Word documents. Surprisingly, for the spring 2020, students actually did some video calling with each other, which they did not quite do in the fall of 2021. All right, so I wanted to share this slide to give you a sense of how long the collaboration is. So as you can see here, so these are some of the major steps that students have to go through, and it takes about a little bit more than a month. So typically, halfway through this collaboration, the class is also moving forward. So students are still working on the collaboration, but also moving on with other assignments in the class. Just to give you a sense of the different things going on in students' life for the class. So for the planning side of this collaboration, there are two sides to it. There's the instructor's side, and then there is the student side. For the instructor's side, essentially Barbara and I get together, before the start of the semester, and we discuss what main assignment we'd like to do for TAP. We discuss any specific TAP assignments that we'd like to do, like the pre-learning report or the post-learning report. The third point is really critical, the schedule, because my semester typically starts earlier than Barbara's, and it also ends earlier than Barbara's. So we do have to figure out a good time that would work for the both of us. The grading is typically pretty easy. Each one of us assigns, whatever grade point we want to the different assignments. And the final bullet point here can be tricky too. It's the pairing of students. So sometimes, we have different numbers of students in our classes. So that gets a bit tricky in terms of how do we pair students when our numbers don't match. On the student side of things, one of the key things that they need to do is to negotiate collaboration deadlines. So a couple of slides back, I gave you a sense of, the major steps and the major, time frame for each step, right? But within those major deadlines, students have many deadlines that they can set for each other. So during the collaboration, these are really up to the student to negotiate those mini deadlines that they want to set for themselves. The same thing with tools. Whenever we think of tools, so what are they going to use for the peer feedback part, for communicating with each other? That is really up to the students. So typically students use what they're most familiar with, which is email, and of course, Google Docs, or Word with comments. They have been quite resistant about doing video calls, even though, most of us are used with Zoom or kind of using Zoom now. But I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that this changes in future semesters. But there are some tricky issues with tools too. So for example, sometimes students, even though their partner may be using something and they agreed to it, there's still some learning curve to it. For example, not all students are familiar with the commenting part in Word, so how to make comments in Word. Or if you want to use Google Docs, sometimes you will have to create a Google account to be able to use all the elements of Google Docs. So there are all these elements that students need to think about when they're planning which tools to use. The third one is a big one, how to deal with conflict in any collaboration. So typically, most collaborations go very well. Sometimes there are minor conflicts, and what I like to do is to allow students to negotiate how to deal with that conflict. So I think of it as a good way to practice how to deal with conflict once they hit the workplace and they have to work in teams there. Although, of course, Barbara and I are always available. So in cases where, for example, the student is sending an email to the partner and they're not getting a response and they don't know what to do, then we intervene, and we really help them with that. But in terms of minor conflicts, in terms of trying to work with each other, then we really try to let the students really handle those minor elements of the collaboration. And the last part is actually really critical. So students need to be willing to engage in the collaboration. So they need to, and thankfully most of them are, but still they need to be willing to accommodate each other's needs. They need to be able to willing to work with each other. Especially, for example, if they have to meet, via virtual meeting, video call, they have to work along with difference in time zones. So they really need to be willing to engage in all the intricacies of the collaboration. So moving on to the sort of next part of the presentation, TAP itself has some challenges that it can present for students, right? One of them is peer feedback. And so when students get into the classroom, oftentimes they do not really know how to provide good peer feedback to each other. So one easy way to resolve that is to, prepare students in advance. So we help them do peer feedback ahead of TAP with, their fellow classmates. We teach them how to do that peer feedback so that they can bring that knowledge to TAP and then, be a good collaborator in TAP. Same thing with tools. I already mentioned that before, but sometimes, even tools that can seem easy and that we use a lot, it can be tricky because some of us might be more familiar with Google Docs, some of us might be more familiar with Word, and sometimes, you have to adjust to maybe making things work with what your partner is more familiar with. The third one is a big one, project management. Like I said before, we set the collaboration generally how it's going to work. But students have to plan their work around the deadlines and plan mini deadlines. So students need to really know how to handle working different parts of the project, handling other stuff that is going on in the course, maybe making things work when their partners are falling a little bit behind or when they're falling a little bit behind. So they really have to develop those project management skills as they work with TAP. I already talked about conflict resolution, so I'm not going to talk about that now. And the last point, actually, I'm happy to say most students are really excited about TAP. So the first week of TAP, they tend to be very nervous about TAP because they don't know what it's really going to be like. But then they're also really excited to get such a great experience. So with these challenges, due to TAP, with TAP itself. In this slide, I'm going to talk about the challenges with COVID, and then move on to how these challenges with COVID impact TAP. So, there have been many papers talking about how COVID has affected higher ed. And some of these changes I've listed here. So, for example, in spring 2020, students were moving to an online classroom environment. So this is a time when, universities were closing down, students were moving off campus, back home, and several things were changing, right? So one of the things that were changing, all of the classes were suddenly online in different modalities, asynchronous, synchronous, with each modality presenting different challenges that students had to adapt to. The other issue with moving off campus is that students had limited resources to work with. So for example, they could no longer access physical books in the library. They did not have the university's really rapid internet connections. They might not have access to the university's laptops or computer labs. The one more thing here too, my class was already online asynchronous, which was helpful, especially with TAP. But I think as, some papers have talked about, like Aristovnik et al. 2020, with all the other classes also moving online, students felt that they had an increased workload. And that made, working in each individual class a little bit harder for students. The third and fourth bullet points here are very similar. So when I'm thinking about emotional strain, there are a couple of elements here. So students were dealing with, the fear of the pandemic itself, the stress of having maybe sick family members, and also the stress of maybe having financial difficulties. So they still had to pay, similar amounts of tuition, but they lost a job or their families lost jobs. It was a very, stressful time for students. And as we've seen before, with previous research, having that sort of emotional stress on you can really impact how students do in classes. So that was in spring 2020. In the fall of 2021, a lot of that was still going on. So yes, students were more familiar with online classes. A lot of them were moving back to campus, but still there were some issues. For example, they had limited access to resources. So for example, not everyone was comfortable spending lots of time in the library, due to health issues, right? So there was still some limitations in resources. The third point actually was harder on students, I see. From what I've been seeing, the more time we spend in the pandemic, the harder it is for students because they are really exhausted with the whole duration of the pandemic. So there's, the ongoing stress of having sick family members, plus the stress of maybe deaths in the family, plus the ongoing financial strain. It really gets to students. Now, the reason I talked about these challenges in general to higher ed, it's because it directly impacts how students engage in classes, and of course, how students engage, in collaborations like TAP. So one of the things that is critical for TAP is students' ability to connect virtually with each other, right? So when they are off campus or they don't have access to the resources that campuses offer, it can be difficult for students to successfully engage in TAP. So for example, if they don't have access to rapid internet or to, a laptop, it might be difficult for them to do the kind of peer feedback that we want them to do in TAP. And the last two bullet points about that emotional stress and the financial strain, I think can really impact TAP as well. So in any collaboration, there is an emotional dimension, right? So students have to be willing to collaborate. They have to be in the right mental space to collaborate and to work with each other, right? I've talked about all that negotiations before. So when students are under, increased stress, it makes collaborations a little bit more difficult because they have to be a little bit more flexible in terms of accommodating each other's needs. So for example, the partner might be dealing with something and they have to give them more time to work on something. And the same applies to them. They might be dealing with, an event in their lives and the partners need to accommodate the needs. So with the pandemic, it makes these stresses that students have to deal with, even more prominent with things like collaboration, especially TAP collaborations. So having said that, then what can we do as instructors, to really help students in those times to successfully do a collaboration like TAP? The first few points, I think, deal with how we can encourage students to use institutional resources. So the first one is mental health. I think encouraging students, and all institutions do provide those mental health resources. The key is to get them to the students in need and to really emphasize that, they have these resources they can rely on to help them. And, once they have that, then they can do better in their academic life and of course in their TAP collaboration. So same thing with financial help, rely on those institutional governmental resources. The third point is about training. So a lot of us now know how to navigate online classes, Zoom, things like that. But I think it is also critical to keep providing this training, from both institutions providing this training, but also instructors helping students get more in touch with how they can be better at online learning. And the last 2 points are directly about TAP. I think one critical thing that we can do is help students focus on their emotions. So in those reflections that students, write throughout TAP, they can talk more about how they're feeling about the collaboration, what's working, what's frustrating, why is it frustrating? And by processing these emotions, they can make that experience a better experience for them. The fifth one is about being more flexible. And I think that's on us instructors to make deadlines a bit more flexible for students. So they have that wiggle room, if things come up, they know, they're not stuck, that they do have that wiggle room to work with. And the last point is actually really important. And I know I'm a little bit over time, so I'll be really quick. But the last point is that, TAP is a great, wonderful experience to help people forge connections across universities. So I think that we should definitely keep doing a collaboration like TAP during moments of crisis, because, when everything looks so bleak and the world is so divided, it can be really positive for students to connect with people from, different countries, different cultures. It can help them broaden their experiences, and it can help them feel more connected to others in times like this. Patricia, can I finish this last slide? Okay.
Yes,
So,
my dear, you can.
thank you. So the last slide is just what I was thinking in terms of future directions. So what I've done here is look at 2 different universities in 2 different states. So the context might be a little bit different. And I'm also really focused on only my observations and informal conversations with students to guide this. So what I want to do in future work is to have more concrete data. So survey instructors engaging in TAP during COVID to get a sense of how they have been experiencing TAP and what they've been doing. And of course, the key is also talking to students, doing surveys and interviews to get a sense of how they are experiencing TAP during COVID. All right, on that note, I'll end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chakrika. It was really, really very interesting. My long years with TAP collaboration and writing articles and going to different conferences, and I can see how it was difficult, in particular, maybe for students that they cannot work anymore, as we had. And as I said previously, we discovered in France that a lot of students didn't have any internet connections during the pandemic because they were foreigners, because they were not living with their parents, because they were used to go to university to have internet connection. They could not reach that. And so we discovered really that. So thank you very much, Chakrika. Would you like to ask some questions? I can see questions. Dr. Yogesh Kumar, did the research have R&B approval for informal discussion with students?
That's a really good question. And actually, that's why I want to have more concrete data, because with these informal discussions, I'm not using it to write a paper with. So it's mostly my observation. So I did not seek IRB approval for this. But definitely for the future steps in the research direction, so with the student surveys and interviews and collecting student reflections, or talking more with other instructors, I would definitely be seeking IRB approval to really have that concrete data and get the work out. But that's a good question. I was really sad because I had all that amazing like informal conversations, and I was like, I really want to write this paper, but I did not have IRB approval, so that's why it's like in the future steps.
Marie put a note in because we don't know in Europe what is IRB approval.
It's approval from your university to do research. And actually IRB has changed in terms of surveying. So I would review the latest with your IRB department head, because I'm actually going to be doing an online survey and I did not need IRB approval from my university. So the rules have changed.
Exciting. Thank you.
Institutional Review Board. I think this is all about ethical implications. So we are also doing collaborative research. I'm based in Oman, and I'm working with 5 universities in USA where our collaborative partners are. And essentially it all boils down to IRB approval, and that's quite tricky, and you need to go online, offline, whether you're going to do the interview through email, through Zoom, or through in-person interviews, all kinds of approvals. If there is any bit of tweaking in between that, they go back to IRB. In Oman, where I'm working at the moment, it is the equivalent of IRB is not so strict as our understanding of it. But as I could understand through my partners, collaborative partners in the research, that IRB is something of a big hassle over there. I mean, that's good also in a way. I mean, it's something which enriches your experience of doing research and all. So there's nothing bad about it, but that's something which is there as such.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Yogesh Kumar. Thank you. Barbara, you wanted to say something?
Yes, if I may, just a word or two. Thank you very much, Chakrika, for sharing your thoughts. I think that you emphasize something that we never discussed before, but we might perhaps, that is the effective side of the collaboration. I think there's a certain asymmetry between our groups of students, because my students are non-native students of English, and yours are obviously of various background, but they are basically there. They are familiar with all the cultural artifacts and all the nuances of life there. So I not in our cooperation, but in previous periods of cooperation with Heather Slomsky from North Dakota, and then from Minnesota University, we were asking our students how they felt effectively and emotionally about the cooperation. And my students were enthusiastic about it, but also they felt a kind of anxiety and also certain embarrassment. They even kind of, they were frightened sometimes that their work is going to be presented to scrutiny of the native speakers of English. So they were uneasy about the results. After some time, when they saw the reaction of the American students, it was a very nice and stimulating and encouraging experience for them. So I would be anxious to carry on and see whether a similar reaction might be the share of your students and mine. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, because I've noticed. So I have my students typically also do like weekly reflections, and in that first week, it's the same feeling that you're describing, Barbara, of like fear, of anxiety with that collaboration, that they don't really know a lot about their partners, and they want to put their best foot forward, and that generates a lot of anxiety for them.
Yeah.
But just like you said, as they get to know their partners and they get to connect with them and realize, no, we're very similar, in fact, students, then that anxiety sort of subsides, and they get really, really excited about it and move on.
There was also the sense of pride on behalf of my students when some of your students said, I mean, not yours, but Heather's, I liked your writing and liked your essay and things like that. So they really felt appreciated. So it was a very, very positive experience for them from this point of view. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I did a